Our nervous system, aka our brain, spinal cord, and nerves, are made up of billions of cells. If we think about the brain, what is the first cell that we think of? Chances are we think of a neuron, which is the cell type in our brain that sends and receives electrical impulses or signals. However, neurons are not the only cell type found in our brain. The brain also contains what we call neuroglia, or glia for short. It's important to note that we have many more glia than neurons in our brain. Specifically, it is estimated that for every neuron that we have in our brain, there are 3 glial cells. Neuroglial cells are very different to neurons, both in their structure and function. Unlike neurons, glia cells don't have axons and dendrites, and they tend to be a lot smaller than neurons. In this video, I will briefly talk about some of these glia and the many roles they carry out in our brain. Until not too recently, neuroscientists didn't think glia did much in the brain, and we didn't understand their function in a lot of detail. We thought that glial cells formed a brain connective tissue that held neurons together, sort of like a glue. This is highlighted by how glia got the name glia, as the word glia comes from the Greek word for glue. However, many years of lab-based research have uncovered several important functions of glia, and I'm sure there will be many studies to come that reveal even more important roles for glia in promoting brain health. Let's chat about what we know about specific glial cells. If we were to take a very small piece of someone's brain tissue and place it under a microscope, we can visualize what the different types of brain cells look like and how they are structured and positioned in space. And this is what I'm showing here. The first cell that stands out here is a neuron. Now, how do we identify a neuron? Well, we can see there is a cell body or soma with multiple dendrites and a single axon connected to the cell body. We can also see that this cell is a lot bigger than the surrounding cells. If we look at the axon of this neuron, we can see that there is another cell that has some parts wrapped around the axon of the neuron. This cell is a type of glial cell called an oligodendrocyte. Oligodendrocytes are the myelin-producing cells in our brain. Myelin is essentially a lipid sheath that wraps around axons and helps to speed up the conduction velocity of action potentials along axons. And myelin sheaths are what are affected or degenerate in diseases like multiple sclerosis. So, what we can see here is an oligodendrocyte wrapping around a neuron's axon to myelinate it, which will essentially help a neuron with its electrical signaling ability. Keep in mind that myelin-producing cells in the peripheral nervous system are Schwann cells, not oligodendrocytes, but we'll not discuss these here. What other cells can we see here in my drawing? You might notice this cell here that looks kind of like a star or has a star-like shape. This is a type of glial cell called an astrocyte. Now, if you ever forget about what an astrocyte looks like, remember that the word astro relates to space travel and stars. For example, astronaut. So you'll remember that astrocytes look like a star. Astrocytes have heaps of important functions in our brain. For example, they have a structural role where they help to anchor neurons to be in close contact with blood vessels. And this is important as neurons need a very rich blood supply to receive nutrients, etc. Astrocytes are also involved in neuroplasticity, or the ability of neurons to form new connections or rewire, but the precise mechanisms for this are still being investigated. Astrocytes can also release and take up neurotransmitters and mop up ions in the extracellular space, so they can control the electrical and chemical communication between neurons. But Very importantly, astrocytes help form the blood-brain barrier. Our brain is a very important organ, so we need to be able to control what gets into the brain from our blood. If harmful molecules get into the brain, they could cause damage. So the blood-brain barrier acts as a wall that separates nervous tissue from its blood supply and only allows very small or lipid-soluble molecules to enter. We can see here that a part of the astrocyte, called the end feet, attached to blood vessels in the brain. Let's zoom into the connection between the end feet and the blood vessel. What we have here is a cross-section of a blood vessel. The inside is where there would be blood cells and other molecules, aka the lumen, and the actual blood vessel itself is made up of endothelial cells. Between endothelial cells of capillaries in the brain, there are tight junctions that are formed, aka the endothelial cells are packed together very tightly, which prevents certain molecules from leaking into the brain from the blood. On the outside here, we have the end feet of astrocytes, where the astrocytes talk to the capillary. We think that astrocytes act to support the endothelial cells in maintaining these tight junctions and signal for the endothelial cells to form these tight junctions in the first place. Okay, so far the glia we have talked about are oligodendrocytes and astrocytes. These are known as macroglia, but we also have microglia. Microglial cells, as its name suggests, is a smaller type of glial cell, and we can see a microglial cell here. Microglia act as immune cells in our brain. When microglia sense a pathogen, debris, or something that shouldn't be in the brain, they can engulf these foreign molecules and destroy or break them down in a process known as phagocytosis. Microglia also help degrade or break down old or unnecessary synapses or connections between neurons, so that only relevant or important synapses remain. The last glial cell I would like to mention are ependymal cells. In the ventricles of our brain and the central canal of the spinal cord, there are ependymal cells. Surrounding our brain and spinal cord, and within it, there is cerebrospinal fluid. Ependymal cells sit between the cerebrospinal fluid and nervous tissue. Ependymal cells produce cerebrospinal fluid at the choroid plexus of the ventricles, and ependymal cells also have cilia on their surface, which help circulate or move the cerebrospinal fluid throughout the nervous system. Thanks for listening.